The first Fu Manchu film that I was in, The Face of Fu Manchu, and far and away the best. Again, you're back to a similar thing with Hammer and the Dracula movies. Gradual progression in the wrong direction. Became too easy to sell, too easy, too easy, too easy. We just make it, we'll make money. And eventually the quality deteriorates. Fu Manchu, one of the great characters of fiction. Another Napoleon of crime, only this time from the East.
C'est un câble de Hong Kong.
Mauvaise nouvelle?
Oui.
I didn't see him as an anti-hero. I saw him as a man who simply considered that it was his for preordained destiny to rule. And he certainly wasn't particular about the methods that he used. And of course, because of the stories, it was, as I said earlier, untraceable poisons, deadly venom, and all this kind of thing, all very sort of from the mysterious East. But I tried to play him as a man of gigantic intellect, as I said, somewhat like Moriarty, who happened to be a Chinese. Now, there were, I believe, objections in San Francisco from people in Chinatown saying, wait a minute, Chinese are not like this. My answer to that was, it's imaginary. Is he undignified? No. Does he do anything offensive? No. He has a great brain? Yes. Well then, please don't accept this as some form of, imitation Chinese. But when I tell you that I have photographs, in fact I even have the poster from the subways in New York at the time of the mayor's elections, which say Fu Manchu for mayor, and there's a picture of me there. I'm sure you know about that. But, well, I believe he even got a few votes. But no, again, a great opportunity, I feel, which was misused. I don't think perhaps we should ever have made any more than the first. I think Boris only did it once, didn't he? Yes. Of course, Warner Oland did it before Boris. And Warner Oland, as people don't seem to know, was Swedish. He wasn't Chinese at all. And of course, he was famous as Charlie Chan. His name was Olander, I believe, and he certainly wasn't Chinese. He made his name playing a Chinese. Sidney Toler took over, didn't he? And J. Carroll Nash, I think, did in a different way as a Chinese detective. Maybe not as Charlie Chan, but as something else. And they all, it was a bit of a caricature, number one son, and all this kind of thing. And Chinese have ancient custom, this kind of thing, which I think is way over the top and quite offensive, quite frankly. I didn't play it like that. I played it with my voice, except the Chinese voice is not usually the same timbre as my own. So I raised my voice slightly, like that, made it slightly staccato. That was what I tried to do anyway.
Une semaine. L'attente ne sera pas longue. Mes plans seront mis en action et le monde tremblera devant ma puissance.
Wonderful stories, well, probably expensive in some respects, but very entertaining, great fun. And we had a lot of fun making them. The killer for me, of course, was the makeup. Oh, dear. And the first film, we had a lot of problems because, first of all, it was appallingly cold and muddy. And we were shooting in buildings where water was coming down the walls, condemned buildings and things like that. And we shot the film, as I recall, virtually all of it, I think, in Ireland. As far as I remember, I think all of it, in and around Dublin. And there is a scene where Fu Manchu is in his car outside a building, and his daughter, played by, of course, Sai Chin, comes charging up with some papers that are needed or whatever, and jumps into the car. And that was the day when there's a photograph taken of me and Mrs. Roma discussing, and at the other end of the street, right down at the end of the street, was a funeral procession of the remains of Sir Roger Casement, who had been executed in this country as a spy during World War I. and they had been returned for burial in Ireland. So that was really a very strange experience. But it was an excellent movie, the whole period atmosphere. Nigel Green was magnificent, Nayland Smith. Howard Marion Crawford was the perfect Dr. Petrie. I mean, Holmes and Watson, of course, no question. And that's why I think that, in a way, Fu Manchu was Moriarty. And I have a feeling that Sax Rohmer must have been influenced by Conan Doyle. He must have been, because you have three characters there, and apart from their nationalities, and there's enormous similarities in certain areas. Nayland Smith represented the empire, you know, and so on and so forth. I wouldn't say that Holmes necessarily did that. He represented his age, you might say. But it was a very good movie and very well made, and Don Sharp did a beautiful job. And everybody in it was extremely good. But we did have problems because we shot a certain amount at Kilmainham Jail, Kilmainham Prison, which is the outskirts of Dublin. The scene where I come down, or rather my double, comes down for execution. I actually came out of the execution chamber and walked down the steps. Well, nobody said anything about that. And you went past these old broken down cells, and there were names above them. One of them was De Valera. I remember that. And others. Imprisoned by the British, presumably. And then we shot some scenes outside, I think with Tibetan lamas or monks or something, and with me and Saichin and these people. And all of a sudden all hell broke loose because people came charging up and said, "You are walking on..." Well, we had animals. We had chickens and goats and things like that wandering about. They said, "This is desecration of holy ground." And we didn't know what was meant by that. We were all a bit taken aback, to say the least. "What do you mean? You cannot possibly shoot here. We will ban you from shooting in this area. You cannot do so. It's out of the question. You are trampling on, walking on, and allowing animals to desecrate and profane holy ground." And it transpired that many of the heroes of the Republican movement were buried there, who had been executed there. And so, to say the least, that was a big shock. Well, we naturally moved away right away and immediately restructured the whole thing. But those sort of problems can suddenly arise out of nowhere without anybody knowing anything about it. Actually, the Irish production manager or location manager or whoever should have known.
Une fois encore, la roue du destin a fait un tour complet.
Almost out of my mind was the makeup. Now, I played a Chinese before in an Edgar Wallace story called The Devil's Daffodil, in which I played a Chinese detective in German. Not quite sure how you do that, but I managed to get through it. Not quite sure how you play Chinese in German, but at any rate I did. So I'd had that makeup on. Now, what happens is you have to make a mold of the eye, the whole eye. And you have to make a piece of, nowadays it's much more advanced, but in those days, in 1965, I think, 36 years ago, makeup was not nearly so advanced, and the material was thicker. You had to make a piece that started here, went up here, all the way in underneath the eyebrow, down and out to here, and came straight along the bottom of the top lid. That's what the makeup man had to do. Well, there are certain problems for the actor. If you have this on, which is rigid, if you look down, your own eyelid appears. If you look up, all you see is the white of your eye. So I had to play the whole part almost on a sort of level axis, which made things, to put it mildly, somewhat difficult for me, purely in terms of performance. What was worse was that the poor makeup man had to deal with materials which, once they got in front of the lights, changed color. Originally, it matched, more or less, the skin tone of the rest of my face, which of course it would do, but it changed colour and it went white. So this man had to dash forward roughly every 5 to 10 minutes and with a brush and keep repainting. And this was almost the last straw for me, as you can imagine. It was difficult enough anyway and uncomfortable enough anyway. It took at least 2 hours to put on. But with all this rushing forward, because the cameraman or the operator would say, I'm sorry, colour's changing again, and dab, 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 fiddle, 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 particularly around the eyes. I don't know how I kept my sanity, I really don't. But it was a very good movie.
C'est une faute grave d'avoir permis à Nellan Smith de pénétrer dans votre bureau et de s'en échapper. Si vous tenez à votre existence, vous ferez en sorte que Janssen soit éliminé.
And the first film was very successful. In fact, I have the copy of the review by Judith Crist, who was the absolute #1 film critic in America, the absolute doyenne of film critics. And in her article, she wrote, "Hey, hey, Fu Manchu is back, a succulent delight."